We need a new system. We need a new society. We need to demand that which may have sounded impossible even a few weeks ago, but is not only realizable, but an imperative necessity. All eyes are on Rafah. The gruesome massacre of Palestinians has not slowed Joe Biden's support for the genocidal campaign conducted by Israel in Gaza. On June 8th, people are descending on the White House, tens of thousands, in an international day of protest against the genocide. Welcome to the Socialist Program. I'm your host, Brian Becker. Today, we're talking once again with Layan Sima Fuleihan. She is a Palestinian organizer with the Shut It Down for Palestine coalition. She's a popular educator. She's an organizer, and she is the education director at the People's Forum. She was a speaker at last weekend's People's Conference for Palestine. Layan, welcome back.
It's great to be back.
Layan, let's begin with some media clips about this gruesome massacre. We were in Detroit when the news came. People could not look at the videos. We're not going to show the videos because they're too gruesome. Joe Biden had said if Israel invaded Rafah, that there would be a red line, that he would stop sending weapons to Israel. That turned out to be a lie. One more lie, a fiction. Anyway, let's start with some news clips about what actually happened.
Well, turning now to the Middle East, where dozens more Palestinians are dead after an airstrike in Rafah.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is calling the incident a tragic mistake. Fox 5's Sharon Crowley is here with the latest on this attack, which, Sharon, appears to be one of the deadliest in the war.
Yeah, that's right, Natasha. Israel is now facing more pressure from the international community for the airstrike that killed so many civilians in Gaza Sunday. Here in the U.S., a National Security Council spokesman issuing a statement saying, in part, Israel must take precautions to avoid killing civilians.
Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu admits a tragic mistake was made during a strike on the southern Gaza city of Rafah. 45 people were killed Sunday night when the bombing set fire to a tent city for displaced Palestinians. Half the victims are women and children. Netanyahu did not provide specifics or elaborate on the error while addressing parliament. Israel's military initially said it carried out a precise airstrike on a Hamas compound that killed 2 senior militants.
Well, Layan, there's a number of things there. We didn't show the worst part of the video where children were actually watching their parents burning alive. But one, the U.S. media is characterizing it as a tragic mistake. And secondly, the Israelis said this wasn't actually a mistake. It was a precise operation. Anyway, I want to get your comments.
Well, Brian, it's completely absurd the lengths that the U.S. media and Israel spokespeople will go to try to get around the reality of this incident, which is that Israel directly bombed what was considered to be a safe zone. They bombed an area where there was an encampment of displaced people managed by UNRWA, and that wasn't included in the evacuation orders that Israel had issued to many parts of Rafah, under pressure from the White House, which has been claiming that that Israel needs to do more to protect civilians if they're going to go into Rafah, where there's over 1.3 million people who are seeking shelter after being displaced from other areas of Gaza. And so there's reports now that Israel is doing an investigation because they're claiming that they did a precision assassination of Hamas officials, and that what happened was that there was a major fire caused by other issues. They're claiming that it could have been a weapons storage facility or a storage of weapons that created a fire. So again, now laying the blame on the Palestinians for the massacre that they themselves did with, now it's also been verified, with U.S. bombs. And so it's really like a runaround that the media is trying to do, because the outrage about this has been immediate. It's been widespread. I mean, the images are absolutely horrific. We were in the middle of a session at the conference when we got the news, and it just impacted everybody immediately to see these horrific images coming out of Rafah. And it prompted everyone to immediately look to the White House and say, is this the red line? I mean, this is a direct attack on displaced people, and there is no argument for this being precision or not precision. There's many reports saying that any sort of precision attack on that area, given the density, given the precarity, given the conditions that people are living in, would result in mass casualties. And they're making excuses about what caused the fire, what didn't cause the fire. The thing that caused the fire were the U.S. bombs that Israel dropped on the tents of families seeking shelter. So it's really horrific to see the way in which the White House, Israel, and the mainstream media are trying to maneuver themselves out of culpability following this incident.
Yeah, we were at the conference. The conference, everybody, was an amazing event. It was initiated by the Palestinian Youth Movement. There were large number of Palestinian organizations came together. It was held at the convention center in Detroit. More than 3,600 people came, and it was a multinational, multi-ethnic event. But there were many, many Arab and Palestinian people, and of course, Layan, as you know, in Michigan and in nearby Dearborn, there's a very substantial Arab, Yemeni, Lebanese, and Palestinian community. There's been so few members of Congress who have done anything, in spite of the fact that millions of Americans are in the streets, in spite of the fact that people in mainstream media organizations like CNN and other media outlets, really mainstream reporters and journalists, are resigning because they're so disgusted with the coverage, which is nothing short of an apology for genocide. But so few members of Congress. I mean, there's 435 members of Congress, 100 U.S. senators. That's 500 people who are our representatives. I'm using air quotes. Almost no one speaks out. Well, Rashida Tlaib came to the conference, and she spoke right before the massacre, or before we heard of it. But she was addressing the issue of the red line, because Biden said if Netanyahu goes into Rafah, he's crossing a red line, and the U.S. would not send the weapons to carry out the Rafah military operation. Let's listen to Rashida Tlaib. I mean, really important comment on her part, and the fact that she's almost alone, or alone, in terms of Congress people speaking out, speaks volumes about the nature of our so-called democracy.
You are an enabler, President Biden. The International Court of Justice just ruled that the Israeli government must stop its invasion of Rafah. But President Biden says what's happening in Gaza is not a genocide. Where's your red line, President Biden? When I tell my colleagues we gotta fight for clean air and clean water, who's gonna pay for it? How about we stop supporting genocide and supporting endless wars? Many of my colleagues come whispering to me, I'm so glad you're here. I'm so glad you said that. Why are you whispering? Well, Rashida, you know, I don't support Netanyahu. Well, you just send him $14 billion.
I mean, right on. I mean, what she said is, why are you whispering? They say, oh, I'm so glad you're here. Why are you whispering? We have to do something to prioritize saving the environment. She says, well, let's spend the money for clean water and clean air. Instead, they just spent $14 billion more for bombs, big bombs, 2,000-pound bombs, 1,800-pound bombs, missiles, all of which is used against a civilian population in one of the most densely packed areas on the planet Earth. I mean, whatever one says about Hamas, it has no navy, it has no air force, it has no standing army. For 8 months now, the Israelis, using these advanced weapons, have pounded a civilian population.
Absolutely. And the I'm sorry.
It's all right. No problem.
Absolutely. And I think what we're seeing and what Rashida is referring to is interesting insight on the atmosphere inside Congress. The fact that she is there are colleagues of hers that are whispering and saying, "Thank you for saying that." It shows the level of division at the highest level of the US government. We've had now multiple mid-level executives from the State Department and other bodies of government resigning over this issue. And I mean, people can't help the fact that the moral outrage over the genocide is mainstream at this point, and these officials are supposed to be representing the people that elected them, and they're all getting a lot of pressure from the grassroots movement. They're getting a lot of pressure from their constituencies. People have varying opinions on the nature of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, but there is general consistency now across US public opinion around the bare minimum that the United States should not be funding Israel to be killing families, civilians, children. And this latest assault on Rafah just has added a lot to the push, the outrage that now the White House is going to have to deal with. And Rashida being the lone voice, I mean, is not insignificant. Rashida's base is largely Arab and Muslim, and she's representing Michigan, which is a place that both Biden and Trump have been courting over the past 8 months, trying to make it out like they're the ones who are going to better represent the interests of the Arab and Muslim population, because the Arab and Muslim population here in the United States is large, is significant, and is pulling away from the Democratic Party that usually it is supporting. And Rashida is actually not a voice for the Democratic Party in this context. She came to the People's Conference for Palestine, and she said, "Listen, we're not going to support anybody who supports genocide." She's actually reflecting the general opinion of her base, which is a huge threat to Biden's campaign, a huge threat to the Democratic Party, and is very encouraging for people um, who are fighting for some sort of change in U.S. policy.
CNN was at the conference. They had a crew there. I talked to them. I was interviewed by them for a while. They're going to do it some sort of documentary, and I think they did some coverage of the conference. But the interview that I had, Layan, was quite interesting because it lasted about 45 minutes, and the crew had an assignment. Their question was basically the same question with 100 different iterations, and it went something like this: if you abandon Biden, if you are supporting the uncommitted vote, as the Arab American community in Michigan did so effectively during the Democratic primary, and the same in Minnesota, the same in many other states, where hundreds of thousands of people vote uncommitted in a Democratic primary, saying basically we're not going to vote for Biden. If you do that, aren't you in effect making it possible for Donald Trump to come back to the White House? And won't Donald Trump be worse for the Palestinians? Won't he, in fact, be worse? And that's an important question, Liam, because when we have these options as the two likely options for who's going to become president, they're both bad. They're both really bad. People don't want to vote for Biden because he's committing genocide. Donald Trump said over the weekend that he would crush Palestinian demonstrators. He would deport foreign students or students who are coming from some other country if they participate in Palestine protests. So, are you, by abandoning Biden, jumping out of the frying pan and directly into the fire? I mean, that was the essence of the CNN question. And I said to them, well, look, it's not really about whether you think Donald Trump is going to be a threat to democracy, which is the other part of what they were posing, not simply that he'd be bad for the Palestinians. They said, isn't Trump a threat to democracy? And I said to them in the interview, I'm not diminishing that Donald Trump is a threat to democracy or a threat to Palestinians or a threat to people engaged in First Amendment speech or dissent in the United States. That's real. But you cannot ask people whose families are being slaughtered in Gaza right now, meaning the Arab community, the Palestinian, Yemeni, particularly the Palestinian community in Michigan. You can't ask them to vote for somebody committing massacres against their family because later there might be an even greater threat to democracy. I mean, when you put it in those terms, it makes it quite clear, I think, that it's not the people who are abandoning Biden's fault for abandoning him. It's Biden's fault for carrying out a genocide against their family. Anyway, let's get your take.
No, exactly. I mean, I think that's the exact framing. It's if Trump gets elected, it's Biden who paved the way for him. It's Biden who refused to listen to any part of his population, refused to actually act as an elected official. I would even go farther and say that Biden is also representing a threat to democracy. And not just Biden, I would say both ruling parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, consistently are not serving the interests of the US population. We're in a moment right now where that's much more clear than it's ever been before because there is such a mass movement that is very clearly articulating its political demands to the White House. And the White House is obstinately and consistently showing not only bipartisan unity in their support for the Israeli genocidal project, but also showing that they are not only unwilling to compromise and to actually answer the demands of the population, but they're willing to unleash state repressive force on those who are speaking up under protected speech, those who are pushing the movement forward, those who are expressing their demands in larger and larger numbers. I mean, under Biden, we had police forces invading campuses, basically. We all remember those scenes from a couple of weeks ago. Obviously, Trump represents a very repressive use of state institutions against democratic processes. He represents a lot of things that would set us back in different areas of social life, of economic life, political life in the United States. But Biden is doing the same exact thing if you actually look at it clearly. I mean, Biden has not really advanced anything progressive since he's been in the White House, and he is the one who is not only to go further than Rashida, not only enabling the genocide, he's orchestrating it. He's working closely hand in hand with Netanyahu. We've talked on this show before about the kind of strategic tactical differences that perhaps he has with Netanyahu, but he is committed at the end of the day to the basically the elimination of the capacity for the Palestinian people to resist. And to do that, he's been very willing to sign off on the mass massacre of Palestinian people, children being a huge number of that over the past 8 months. The fact that his red line came up over Rafah, very important. He should have had a red line from the beginning. We had a red line from the beginning. But now, even with the red line very clearly being crossed, it's disappeared. So we can see that he really doesn't represent anything that can be. You can't argue, given this context, you can't argue that the Democratic Party right now is going to offer some sort of solution that the Republican Party is like much better than the Republican Party on this Palestine issue. And to ask Palestinians whose family is being massacred, like you said, to vote for Biden out of fear of what Trump is going to bring is absolutely absurd. I think what is the most interesting about this moment and the most important is that Palestinians, Arabs, everyone who has joined in solidarity with the Palestinian cause, who are against genocide, are against both options that are being presented in the 2024 elections. And we need to understand that this is a problem of democracy overall. Biden is not representative of some sort of great democracy. He certainly has not been. Trump will bring his own set of challenges, but people are realizing that the system itself is what is a threat to democracy.
Yeah, it's a very tortured form of democracy. And we talked about that at the conference, the Palestine conference in Detroit, the People's Conference for Palestine. I mean, you have the US voter has the option between picking between two militarists, two imperialists, two people who are committed to endless war, two people who are committed to the Zionist project of dispossession of the Palestinian people. So is that variety? I mean, the fact that you get to vote every 2 or 4 years for people who are standing with imperialism, is that democracy? I mean, since the founding of the country after the passage of the US Constitution, Leanne, the US had elections every 4 years for the presidency, and at the same time, it retained the system of human slavery. I mean, the principal, biggest, most important part of the working class, especially in southern states, were enslaved people. So you had democracy, a bourgeois democracy, a democracy for the bourgeoisie, where some part of the male population, white male population, received the franchise as of 1828, at least, when the election with Andrew Jackson. But at the same time, it was a system of slavery. So can you have a democracy and a system of slavery at the same time? Well, yes, if it's a particular type of democracy, a tortured democracy, a bourgeois democracy. And even though the system of slavery is gone as a consequence of the armed struggle, principally of the enslaved people during the Civil War, where hundreds of thousands of enslaved people ran away, picked up the gun, and fought what was a war of national liberation. Even though that system of slavery has ended, the other systems of oppression continue. Not to mention the ongoing genocide that was conducted after the US Civil War against the indigenous populations of North America. So, yes, it's democracy, but of a particular type, a tortured democracy, I would say, not a people's democracy, but a bourgeois democracy. I want to go back to the red line issue because, as we mentioned in the beginning of the show, Biden said there was a red line. He was trying to deflect or distract growing outrage against him for supporting Netanyahu's genocide in Gaza. He said, well, if they invade Rafah, that's a red line. And Netanyahu invaded it. And now there's like, oh, there was no red line, or it's not violating the red line. On June 8th, as I mentioned, tens of thousands of people from all over the United States are coming to Washington, D.C., and all of us together are going to form a giant red line that's going to surround the White House, saying we are creating the red line. We have no confidence in the Democrats or the Republicans. We're going to do this. People around the world are coming together on June 8th to do it. I saw the International People's Assembly and Progressive International and others have called for June 8th to be an international day of action. I want to go back to the red line issue because, again, in a way, it becomes emblematic of what the problem is. Whenever Biden is cornered by public opinion, he says, oh, there's going to be a red line. After you cross the red line, that's it. We're not going to support Israel anymore. That's it. That's the red line. And then it's all a fiction. Here's a CBS, I believe a CBS News correspondent asking John Kirby, General Kirby, questions about Biden's attitude in the so-called red line. I want to play it and get your reaction.
How does this not violate the red line that the president laid out?
As I said, we don't want to see a major ground operation. We haven't seen that at this point.
How many more charred corpses does he have to see before the president considers a change in policy?
We don't want to see a single more innocent life taken, and I kind of take a little offense at the question.
He's offended, Layan. I think it's really important that it was a CBS, one of the principal capitalist ruling class media outlets, who said, how many charred bodies is it going to take? How many more does he have to see before it's a red line? It reminded me of CBS with Walter Cronkite in 1968 after the Tet Offensive launched by the National Liberation Front in Vietnam, where it became clear to some parts of elite society, including the mainstream media, which is the voice really of the ruling class, that the war could not be won. And suddenly you heard voices like Walter Cronkite, who said at that time to the American people on evening news, and he was considered something of a god in media terms. He said, look, there's no light at the end of this tunnel, meaning you're going to keep sending your sons to fight in Vietnam, and they're going to come back in body bags or without arms or legs, and we're never going to win. There's no light at the end of the tunnel. That was a sign of a disaffection within the capitalist establishment that the media started to reflect it. And that actually exponentially increased anti-war sentiment in the United States. I think this is happening. I think that CBS correspondent, who probably normally every day just, speaks the lines given to them by American ruling class, because you don't want to lose access to the State Department or the Pentagon or the White House. You have to kind of self-censor. but he's outraged.
Yeah, absolutely. And the response from Kirby is absolutely ridiculous. Um, he said he then redefined what the red line is. It's a full ground invasion. And then I was reading a transcript of it earlier, and he then later on kind of describes what a ground invasion would be, and he says it's tanks, it's personnel coming in troops and in formation, kind of like this image, this classic image of ground combat in a major war. And that's not how Israel fights wars. It's actually quite ridiculous. I'm pretty sure the Pentagon has a direct line to the Israeli military. They know better than anyone else the way that Israel fights wars. They have been bombing at large scale. More bombs than they dropped on Afghanistan, more bombs than the US dropped on Afghanistan have been dropped on this tiny area of Gaza. Uh, and this is what has been the thing that has been massacring civilians. And throughout the past 8 months, every single time the White House was caught in a corner, because they've been always saying they care about civilian casualties, they want to protect civilian life, et cetera, they have feigned some sort of ignorance or made some new definition for something to try to argue why the red line is not there. So when the first accounts of the Gaza Health Ministry put out the list of names of those who had been killed, the list of martyrs in the 30,000s, United States says, "Oh, we can't confirm. We can't confirm that that number is correct." And a lot of different White House officials and spokespeople went on media and said, "We can't confirm. That's coming from the other side. We can't confirm if that's correct." When the hospital was bombed directly, the first time the hospital was directly bombed, a hospital in Gaza. By the way, there's no more functioning hospitals across the entire Gaza territory. The White House came out and said, "We don't know who bombed the hospital. We just know that it was bombed. It could have been somebody else." Totally absurd, totally feigning ignorance. Now they're saying the red line is a major ground operation, which with the way that Israel fights wars is asymmetric. They don't go in these like formations with troops. This image that you might get from the movies. They destroy the area. This is actually written. I think we talked about it on your show a couple months ago. This is written in their military strategy documents that they developed through their combat experience in Lebanon, where when they're going against their enemy, which is an entire people, which means they're going into a place that has been occupied, that is highly densely populated. It can be hard it's not like a classic military versus military situation. Like you said, Hamas doesn't have a navy, doesn't have a standing army. These are people in resistance. And so basically, if they're going to eliminate the resistance, they have to eliminate people. They bomb residential areas, they bomb schools, they bomb infrastructure, and then they claim that those are places where the resistance has been hiding or they're using human shields. And so for the White House to say the red line is just a ground invasion fully, and then to ignore the fact that their own bombs are the ones that are being used to massacre people in Rafah is ridiculous. And the last thing I'll say is that as of yesterday, there have been sightings of Israeli tanks inside central Rafah. And the White House again and the Israelis again are denying this. They're saying it can't be confirmed. There's photographic evidence. There's video evidence. It has been confirmed by multiple news outlets and by Palestinians on the ground. So the argument even of a ground invasion is unsustainable.
Yeah, I saw that too. While we were speaking, right before we started, Layan, I saw the Washington Post. I want to read it to you and to the audience. White House says Rafah strike does not violate Biden's warnings to Israel. As images circulate of the deadly Israeli strike on civilians in Rafah, Biden confronts calls to make good on his threat to suspend offensive weapons. The White House said Tuesday that Israel had not violated President Biden's warnings on the conduct of its military campaign in Rafah after an airstrike there over the weekend killed at least 45 Palestinians and injured hundreds more, horribly burned people. The airstrike on a makeshift tent encampment caused the fire to break out. Images of charred bodies and videos of parents burning alive. This is the Washington Post. Burning alive as their children screamed for help, ricocheted across social media, prompting renewed global outrage and growing calls for Israel to halt its offensive in Rafah. Several Biden officials, including Vice President Harris, lamented the quote, heartbreaking, close quote, and quote, tragic, close quote, scenes and loss of life. But they said, here's the kicker, but they said the mass casualty event did not cross the red line President Biden announced this month when he said the United States would suspend delivery of offensive weapons if Israel went into densely populated centers like Rafah. Okay, so nothing, Layan, nothing can be the red line then. If this is not the red line, then there can be no red line. Anyway, I want to move this subject a little bit. Netanyahu has faced a lot of outrage within the Israeli population. They don't necessarily care about the Palestinian people at all. Not seemingly, most of the population doesn't give a damn at all about Palestinians, the loss of life of Palestinians. I'm sure some people in Israel are more troubled by it, but in general, it's not the debate in Israel. The debate is about Netanyahu, about whether Netanyahu should be the head of state, about whether Netanyahu is pursuing his own narrow interest to remain prime minister and not go to jail for corruption, which he probably will do once he's not prime minister, and that he's dragging the war out. And a big part of the Israeli population wants to get the hostages back through negotiations and not to pursue the war anymore. They want to basically have a ceasefire in order to get the hostages back. And at the same time, the reports were last week, and I want to ask you about whether you find these reports credible. The Israelis actually have lost more people, meaning soldiers who have now been captured in the fighting in Rafah and in other parts of Gaza, and they too are now, quote, hostages. So it would appear, if true, and there's lots of evidence that shows that it is true, Netanyahu's strategy is not only brutal and genocidal, it's ineffective because instead of freeing the hostages, it's creating more, quote, Israeli hostages. Anyway, I want to get your thoughts about this report.
I mean, to me, it seems credible, and not just because of the evidence that has been circulating, but because of the major losses that the Israelis have been facing in their as they go into the areas of Gaza, not just Rafah. They've gone back to trying to maintain control over the entire territory, and they're in close. They're facing a lot of resistance. They're taking casualties every day. There's multiple reports of Israeli soldiers being killed or wounded. They are not necessarily, despite the fact that they have the much more superior military infrastructure, weapons. They have massive funding from the wealthiest country in the world. When it comes to actual combat with the Palestinian resistance, it's very difficult for them. They are facing casualties. So I don't see why, besides the fact that plenty of evidence has been circulating, why it wouldn't be the case that there are more Israeli soldiers that have been detained in Gaza. And it just, I think, shows, and part of Israeli society is realizing this. There's another part that perhaps shares Netanyahu's approach, but Netanyahu's priority is clearly not releasing the hostages. His priority is trying to come out of this situation looking victorious and being able to claim the fact that he defeated Hamas. And even now, the National Security Advisor, I think it is, of Israel just stated, yeah, we're ready to go for another 7 months. They would rather drag this out. They said the year of 2024 is the year of combat or something like that. They've named the year of 2024 as the year of combat. They're kind of acclimating Israeli society to get used to the idea that this is going to be a long-term struggle. If you remember, Brian, earlier in the days of the beginning of this genocidal onslaught, even the United States media was, when they interviewed Biden, I forget exactly when this was, but I remember the conversation very well. Biden came on American television for an interview, and they said, how long is it going to take you to achieve victory? We expected this to be a short one, in and out. you've got all our weapons, you've got all this capacity. And now they're saying, oh yeah, from the beginning we told everyone this is going to be a long battle, a long war. So they're getting comfortable with the idea that they want to keep going, they want to keep fighting, they want to keep bombarding, they want to keep invading and trying to occupy Gaza, and that is going to have costs on their personnel. It absolutely is, and there has been no hostages that have been released through military means. If Netanyahu actually had the hostages in his agenda, he would have engaged much more seriously with the negotiating process, and he would be finding ways to close this chapter of his war on the Palestinian people.
I want to play a couple more clips from the Palestine conference. The first one is Vijay Prashad, who was on our show last week, where we talked about the legal definition of occupation, the legal definition of apartheid, and the legal definition of genocide. And that was a very important discussion because Vijay was making the argument, and we were making the argument, that the language around the rights of people to resist occupation, those rights which are enshrined in international law vis-a-vis UN resolutions, that's a consequence of the growing strength of the movements for national liberation, the movements for decolonizations, the movements against imperialism. 100 years ago, there were no rights that were ensconced in law for those who are the victims of colonization, which would have been the majority of people in the world at that time. But the language of international law has changed as a consequence of the struggle against imperialism. And so some of those language changes are a reflection of the growing sort of authority, the moral authority, the legal authority of those who in the past had no rights that were recognized by international law. I want to talk a little more about that with you because we still see law being skewed. We see law and the definitions within legal categories being skewed by imperialist propaganda. For instance, Cuba is listed as a state sponsor of terrorism, so it's on the terrorism list. Hezbollah is a terrorist organization. North Korea, terrorist entity. Hamas, the Popular Front for the Liberation of Palestine, all of the targets of U.S. imperialism and colonialism, they're labeled as terrorists, while the United States sends 2,000-pound bombs to drop on refugee centers in the southern part of Gaza in Rafah. And the people who drop the bombs, the Israelis, they're not terrorists. And the people who provide the bombs, the U.S. Pentagon, they're not terrorists. So terrorism itself is a label for a political purpose. And it's not simply a political purpose. It's designed to limit the field of action, the diplomatic capacity of people who are fighting against imperialism. So I mentioned that because I want to play a clip in a minute of Sana Daka, the widow of Walid Daka, who was the longest held Palestinian prisoner, who was also deemed a terrorist. And the media then deemed her a terrorist and deemed the conference that allowed her to speak a pro-terrorist entity. I want to play that clip. But first, I want to go back to Vijay Prashad, because when we talk about what real terrorism is, I can't imagine anything more terroristic than, say, the dropping of the atomic bomb on Hiroshima or Nagasaki, where in one moment, one bomb could incinerate 100,000 human beings. But Vijay makes the point that what the Israelis are doing to the people in Gaza over the past 8 months in aggregate is like several, or maybe even more than several, nuclear bombs. Let's listen to this clip.
They have already dropped the equivalent of 9 Hiroshima bombs on Gaza. 9 Hiroshima bombs on Gaza. Brutal, hideous war. You know, when the Russians entered Ukraine, the global North leaders were so upset But there are no images coming out of Ukraine that are like the images coming out of Gaza, because the Israelis understand what bombing is like. They bomb like the United States bombed Iraq. They bombed like the United States bombed Afghanistan. They have a different attitude to people because of the international division of humanity. They don't see us as real people. And that, I think, is the reason why we are so particularly upset by the nature of the bombing of the ghastly, wretched Israeli war machine against the Palestinians in Gaza.
I mean, VJ is right, Layan. I mean, this is this toxic mix of capitalism, imperialism, and racism. The racism element is real. The Palestinians or the other targets of US imperialism or US imperialist 2,000-pound bombs, or in the case of Afghanistan, as a trial run, they dropped the quote, mother of all bombs, the 16,000-pound bomb, really as a laboratory experiment for how it would work and what its impact would be. All of this is done with this heavy, heavy dose of racism. And the people of the global South, who were the colonized people, recognize it as racism. So maybe Americans who are affixed to their TV might not immediately, many do, but many may not see it as racism. But the people in the global South see it as racism. And again, think about it like this, everybody. If the US and Israel dropped the equivalent of 9 nuclear bombs on Gaza in 8 months, and Biden still says it's not a red line, that it's still an act of self-defense, and it's the Palestinians, the resistance forces, whether it's Hamas or PFLP or whoever, are listed as the terrorists, it shows that all of this could only be processed in one's brain if one's brain is already infected with the toxin of racism.
I completely agree. I mean, I guess it seems then that the definition of terrorism, like you said, for the United States, is not actually what about terrorism. It's about threatening the interests of U.S. empire. If any project, if any nation tries to seek sovereignty, that tries to overthrow occupation, that tries to demand its own dignity, that tries to say you can't keep us in an open air prison, or like Cuba, even Cuba is how could Cuba be called a state sponsor of terrorism? Cuba sends doctors around the world. Cuba sent doctors to Italy during COVID. Cuba was put on the list while it was facilitating peace talks in Colombia. And so we can only come to the conclusion that for the United States, terrorism means anything that threatens their imperial interests, their own agenda for the world. And so same goes for Israel, obviously. There are no red lines when it comes to Israel's occupation of the Palestinian people. Perhaps the red line, the only time that Biden paused one small, tiny shipment of weapons was when Netanyahu wasn't listening to him. Netanyahu was not following the line that the White House had set for them. He was, being too open about his own agenda for the current phase of their assault on the Palestinian people, and it was not exactly how the White House wanted him to do it. They paused a transfer of shipments, but it wasn't supposed to be public. Biden wasn't actually never intended to follow through on his pause of weapons. He paused a small thing. Maybe it's a red line just for Netanyahu and his relationship with Biden, saying, Netanyahu, you need to listen to exactly what the White House is saying. You need to listen to your sponsors. It was Netanyahu, it was the Israelis who leaked the information about the pause in arms shipment. And, after that, another $14 billion package of weapons went to Israel. There's images on social media now of Nikki Haley signing an artillery shell saying, finish them all. America loves Israel. There's really no indication. There's no way that the United States would actually put a red line on Israel's massacre of Palestinian people because, like you said, they don't see Israel as carrying out anything that could be terrorism, that could be classified as terrorism, because for them, the definition of terrorism is going against U.S. interests. And the United States doesn't want the Palestinian resistance to succeed, isn't interested in a future for the Palestinian people. They are interested in maintaining Israel as their, as Richard Becker said at the conference, their military base in the Middle East region, where they can continue to use strategies of deterrence, occupation, and invasion to maintain control over the many resources of that region.
Indeed. And just for people to know, if you don't know, Cuba being on the state sponsor of terrorism list makes it almost impossible for Cuba to buy anything in the international market because banks will not accept will not accept Cuban currency. Even when Cuba buys something, the banks won't allow the transaction to go through because the banks don't want to be seen or be targeted for aiding and abetting a terrorist entity. So, one of the big problems Cuba has in buying food, and it's an island country, so obviously it has to import many things that don't come from Cuba. But in order to do that, they have to have trade. In order to have trade, you have to have transactions, you have to have a currency, and banks have to process the currency. And the banks, the international banking system, won't take Cuban currency. So the state sponsor of terrorism list, or the terrorism list that's directed against uh, PFLP or Hamas or Hezbollah, it's got many, many different practical functions in order to weaken those who are trying to be independent from the empire. So it's a political label that makes it hard for that entity to carry out diplomatic endeavors. It's always being sort of scrutinized or sort of stereotyped, caricatured as something evil.
من نقله إلى المستشفى، أي أنهم تركوه في السجن ليموت ونقلوه إلى المستشفى حين لم يعد هناك ما يمكن عمله لإنقاذه.
Let's just talk about Walid Daka. Again, Fox News, the right-wing media attacking the conference for having Sana speak there. They said, see, it's a pro PFLB conference or pro-terrorist conference. Obviously, many, many, many organizations came together, but to hear the voice of this woman who is not only representing Walid, who was either killed or died, either way, he was murdered by the Israelis after decades in prison, but she's also the voice of Palestinian prisoners. And there's a lot of them. And Americans don't know about it. They hear all the talk about Israeli hostages. There are thousands, maybe more than 10,000 Palestinian prisoners. Go ahead.
Well, just on that last point, there are so many Palestinian prisoners who are being held against international law. Many of them are not even charged with anything, and there's been reports coming out in the past week about the level of torture that prisoners are going through, in particular during this war on Gaza. So what Sanaa said in the middle of that clip that you showed of her speech, where she said that the Israelis are going to be using the assault on Gaza as a time to get rid of some of their prisoners, is exactly what we're seeing. Just this morning, some reports of multiple Palestinians being beaten to death by Israeli prison guards have been circulating. There's also reports showing the number of people who have been arbitrarily detained and kidnapped from Gaza over the past couple of months, over 2,500 of them, and that number is an underestimate. And they've all been subjected to torture, to many different forms of torture, to violence, to assault. And they're coming back in the worst conditions. There's images of the people who have been released, the few who have been released, and they are bearing witness to intense and brutal psychological and physical torture. And Walid Daka is his experience is almost symbolic of the Palestinian prisoners' experience, and with this huge number of prisoners, there's also a very strong prisoners movement. I mean, going into prison is part of daily life for Palestinian people. Everyone knows someone in prison or is related to someone in prison. Being arbitrarily detained and subjected to brutal, inhumane conditions of prison are the norm for Palestinian prisoners. And despite that, the prisoners' movement is extremely strong. Walid Daqqa is an example of this. Prison literature flourishes. People go to prison and they are educated, they are trained, they are organized so that when they're released, they can continue. But even inside the prison itself, the prisoners find organization and a project to work on collectively that sustains them. Walid Daqqa, by the way, had Israeli citizenship, and so does Sanaa, and so does their daughter Milad. So just to show, this is not a question of combating terrorists or anything like this. They are doing this as someone who technically has citizenship. Walid is a Palestinian who was born in the area of Palestine that is fully occupied by Israel. We call it 48, and there are many Palestinians who have Israeli papers but are not treated like Israeli citizens. And Walid Daqqa is an example of this. And the other, I know I'm saying a lot of different things now about Sanaa and Walid, but it was such a powerful, powerful visit. We struggled to get Sanaa to come to the conference. She has Israeli citizenship, but the United States arbitrarily delayed the processing of her visa. We had to appeal to members of Congress to intervene on her behalf. This is her right. She has a right to come visit. She has a right to come speak at this conference, at this convening. She is a journalist. She is an advocate for the Palestinian prisoners movement. She is someone who has a right to visit. We demand that the rights of our convening be respected. Luckily, Sanaa was able to join us in the middle of the conference. She couldn't come on the time that we had hoped, but she joined us, and you could feel the crowd. You're showing the images now. The energy of people getting to meet her, getting to share space with her was so beautiful and so powerful. And I want to just say a few words about that. Sanaa met Walid while he was in prison. He's been in prison basically his entire life, like she said, 38 years. And despite that, he maintained a desire to build his life. She met as she was part of the prisoners' advocacy movement. She met Walid. They got married. He got a very rare permission to attend his own wedding, so they could meet in person. And then they did the practice of sperm smuggling in order to give birth to their daughter Milad. This is a practice that many Palestinian prisoners have developed in order to continue living their life despite the fact that they've been illegally detained for main parts of their lives. Their success in being able to smuggle sperm and give life to Milad inspired hundreds of other prisoners to do the same. And Milad, in a sense, is a symbol of the project of life of the Palestinian resistance. The Palestinian resistance is their horizon is to have a life, to be able to have your family, to live with dignity and well-being. And despite all the obstacles that would have made it impossible, Walid was able to start a family and leave behind this image of hope and resilience, and a whole bibliography, a whole library of literary works. Walid was an incredible visionary writer. From behind the bars of the prison, was able to give voice to the prisoners' movement beyond the prison walls. And so Sanaa read for us some of the excerpts of his pieces. And to have her here at the conference was such a powerful, powerful moment. It made everybody feel a lot closer to home, and remembering that this is a context, the heart of the Arab diaspora. There's a huge Palestinian population, and most Palestinians are forcibly displaced from Palestine. Most Palestinians who live in the United States, in Europe, across the Middle East, are unable to go back home. This is part of the struggle against the Israeli occupation of Palestine. So to be able to have Sanaa and Milad, who are not just incredible people themselves, Sanaa being an incredible activist and journalist in her own self, but as a symbol of the struggle of the Palestinian people, and what the Palestinian people are fighting for was really incredible for this population here in North America. And everybody who was there at the conference, like you said, a multinational convening of people who are now feeling themselves part of the Palestinian cause and part of that project of life that the Palestinian cause represents.
Layan, as we move towards the end here, I want to go back to something I mentioned in the beginning, which is in 10 days, tens of thousands of people are going to be descending on Washington, D.C. They're going to form a red line. People are going to dress in red. They're going to have red banners. We're going to form a red line around the White House. The strong visual image. I know the Progressive International and IPA, International People's Assembly, have issued a joint statement calling on people all around the world to move, to take action. And June 8th is going to be an International Day of Action. Many other groups are joining in as well. There was an announcement, a social media announcement. I want to play it actually as we leave. We'll play this clip, and then I'll give you the final word. You're one of the key organizers of Shut It Down for Palestine, which has been such a motor force, along with many, many other organizations, but certainly Shut It Down for Palestine has been a motor force in generating constant activity, constant mobilization, constant public education in support of the Palestinian people. And Shut It Down for Palestine, once again, along with the Answer Coalition and others, are playing a principal role in this upcoming June 8th activity. But let's play this. It's about a minute long. I think it really captures the spirit of what everyone is trying to do.
Because on the anniversary of the 1967 war that occupied our land in the West Bank and Gaza, we will mobilize a national action of a red line in Washington, D.C. to show Biden that the people will draw the red line.
Biden said he had a red line. Remember that red line? He said, if Netanyahu dares go into Rafah, that's a red line. We, the United States, will stop sending weapons to Israel. And Israel went ahead and invaded Rafah. And what did Biden do? He continued to send the bombs and the missiles to carry out the massacre in Rafah and throughout Gaza. Biden's red line is a lie. Biden's red line was a fiction. In 2 weeks, on June 8th, we are going to be surrounding the White House with tens of thousands of people dressed in red and letting Biden know and letting the world know and letting Palestine know that we will be the red line to stop the massacre in Gaza.
Layan, people can get in touch with Shut It Down for Palestine. How do they do that? How do they plug in? Is there a transportation page? If you're coming from far away, should you come? This is a big operation in a very short amount of time, but it is an emergency. We could see by what happened, the massacre, and it's massacres, not massacre in Rafah. Anyway, just talk about how people can get involved with June 8th.
Well, it's an all hands on deck situation. We know that everybody is outraged at, like you said, the massacres. There was the one that was the largest one that happened while we were at the conference that we've been referencing, but then yet again, over 2 more in the past couple of days, and an ongoing assault. And we have the call for June 8 is extremely important. We have to be there in large numbers. And I know that we will be there in large numbers because the American population, the majority of the American population, has already drawn the line, has already told Biden in the clearest of terms that we do not consent to his enabling, his funding, his orchestrating of this genocide. This is not something that can continue to be done with American funds and in the American people's name. And so you can go to shutitdownforpalestine.org to get more information. I know that many cities across the country are organizing transportation, and they're going to be uploading the bus information at the Answer Coalition website. But also, you can organize your own transportation, carpools, renting vans, renting buses, and also submit it on the Answer Coalition website for other people to find. It is an all hands on deck situation. We're going to be there in huge numbers, and we are going to form the red line around the correct perpetrator of terrorism. We are going to form the red line around the White House, which is the entity that has been making this genocide possible. For us, our red line, we have clarity where Biden does not, or where at least he would hope that we don't have clarity, so that we believe his maneuvering of definitions and of reality. But the American people do have clarity. We know who the real terrorists are, and we know that the sponsor of terrorism is the White House. And so we are going to draw that red line. We are going to be there in large numbers. I hope everybody can join us, and everyone, even those who have just maybe started becoming active around Palestine, or those who've been here for all 8 months, or those who've been here their whole life, are all going to come together and show our unity in this demand. Enough is enough. End the genocide. The United States can just pick up the phone and end this right now. They can cut all the aid, they can cut all the weapons, and they can create the conditions for Israel to have no other option but to end their genocide. And until now, they haven't done it. So we're going to increase the pressure, and we're going to be at the White House June 8, 12 p.m.
So shut it down, the number 4 Palestine, shut it down for Palestine.org or answercoalition.org. Go there, find out where buses or car caravans are leaving from your area. If nobody's coming from your area, you bring people from your area. Everybody can make a difference right now. Critical moment. The people in Palestine, Layan, were watching the conference. They're watching the demonstrations. They're paying careful attention. It makes a big difference for people living in these kind of tortured circumstances to know that they are not alone. Layan, thank you so much for joining us once again.
As always, thanks so much for having me, Brian.